Hello again, and welcome to War Stories Behind the Scenes Tales from the front lines of the media. I'm your host, Tom Curley. How are you all doing today? For those of you that have never seen the show before, well, what the hell is wrong with you? Um, Basically, we tell old war stories about crazy shit that happened to us. I was a director for CBS for almost 40 years, and this guy was a super famous type person in Boston, veteran TV reporter Gary Armstrong. Gary, how the hell are you today?
I'm just fine.
So, got
Yeah.
no real notes from last week. Um, uh,
Okay. I don't know whether
everybody
it's good or
enjoyed.
bad.
Well, no, it's notes are mostly things we forgot to say or forgot to do. I noticed there wasn't a lot of graphics in the last show. It might have been I forgot to mention that our graphics are done by an artificial intelligence program called the Chironomatic 2000 Instantaneous Graphics Generator, and it seems to be a little sensitive because it didn't really have much to say last episode, and I was wondering if maybe it's because I didn't mention it, or or maybe for all I know it could have just been slacking off on the job. I mean, how long is it going to be before we've got enough AI where they unionize? And what the hell is that going to be like? I have no idea. But
That's
so
very scary.
very, very scary.
Well,
All of it is scary.
I was thinking we the AI aside, part of our show was called War Stories, and I am, I shouldn't put it in the past tense. I'm reading Tom Brokaw's third installment in his Greatest Generation writings. It was a gift. And if you've read any of it, it's well written and it hits you squarely in the heart if you are of our age. If you have had any touch with any of the wars that we have seen in our lifetime or heard about, going from World War II to all the wars or conflicts that followed since. Long story short, I hope in reading these really heart wrenching stories from people who were on the line and people who tried to uh, readjust like the best years of our lives, it got me to thinking about our own war stories. And I wanted to share one with you. But, in writing you a note, which you may or may not have read, I alluded to the
I
fact
did.
that you had war stories of your own from the Navy. Now, did I make a mistake here? Do I have you confused with another ensign Pulver?
Yes, yes, you do. But my father was in the Navy. I was in. I did not serve in the military, and it wasn't. I was not a conscientious objector. This was during the height of the Vietnam War, and see, a lot of people don't realize that back then, the way you entered the armed services was you got drafted. All right, you could volunteer, and a lot of people did, but nowhere near enough to maintain an army. And the same was true in World War II. When World War II first broke out, hundreds of thousands of people, men enlisted, but they drafted most of them. So when I was growing up, if you got drafted, when you were 18, you went down to the selective service and you had to sign in, and you got a card that would give you your status. 1A meant you could be drafted
Right,
anytime, and
right,
you could get a 4F, which was a medical condition, and there was a thriving business back then in ways to get a medical discharge. You wouldn't believe some of the things guys tried, but the war was not popular, and when you got drafted,
right,
oddly enough, the U.S. military is huge, and most of the troops were not in Vietnam, but a lot were, and you could get assigned to Germany or something like that, and you would have a nice
right.
tour, and you would finish, or you can go to Vietnam, which was not good. So In my freshman year, um, you used to be able to get a college deferment. If you were going to college, you could get a deferment. Well, in the first semester of my freshman year, they eliminated all of those things. All deferments were gone, and everybody became 1A. And they instituted a lottery system. It was the first time they, well, actually, it wasn't the first time. I think they did it in World War One, and it was very
Right.
ceremonial. I think it was the Secretary of Defense, probably, I could be wrong, had this big bowl, like a lottery, and there were
Right.
366 pieces of paper, each one with the day of the year, January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, and up to including leap year. And they stirred it. I remember it was something they stirred it with a stick from, I don't know, the USS Constitution or some. It all had
Right.
symbolic meaning. Anyway, he would pick the numbers. So whoever the first date, say the first date was August 2nd. Well, if you were born on August 2nd, you were number one. They were going to draft you, and everybody else who was
Right.
born on August 2nd would be called first. All right. And then they would draw the next number and the next number until they had pulled out all 366 numbers. So the higher your number was, the higher the number you got picked, the less the chance you were going to get drafted, because they would have to go through
Right.
all of the birthdays of all of the people before you. And it also was determined by where you lived. Like they would take a certain percentage from New York City and a certain percentage from Bullsball, Nebraska, a certain from Boston. And so if you lived in a city like New York, where the chances are there's a lot of people maybe with your birthday, your chances of being drafted would be a little better. But if you lived in a small town where they were going to take they had to take somebody from the small town, you were the only guy born on August 2nd, you were screwed. So I remember I was in my dorm room with all of the guys from my floor, okay? And we were watching this on TV because we were all, going to find out whether or not we were going to
Eligible. Hmm.
continue, whether we were going to continue our year at Hofstra University, or we were going to continue with our asses in Vietnam. And one guy, the range was amazing. One guy got number one. He was number one. And another guy got leap year. He was 366. So the range, it was very awkward because here's one guy going, well, my whole life just changed. I'm going to get drafted any day now. And the other guy going, there'd have to be a nuclear war for me to ever get drafted. I'm 366. I was 273. Never forgot that. That's the only lottery that I ever
Right.
won. Um, but now, and because of the Vietnam War, everybody forgets, they ended the draft. The draft is what caused the Vietnam War to end because everybody
Yes.
didn't want to go there. And now it's an all volunteer
Yes.
army. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but every time, uh, like, the Iraq wars and stuff, it would be a Democrat who
Right.
would go, hey, let's put the draft back. And all the Republicans go, no, 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 no. Um,
Yeah.
so now it's an all volunteer army. And I would imagine that there would have to be a sizable uh, chunk of the population that has no memory that the draft even existed. But,
Exactly.
it existed up, and it started in World War One, and it continued to the end of the Vietnam War. So, yeah. So
What
that was my.
you were describing that day, August the 2nd. Um, do you remember your feelings? Your
Oh, I
feelings.
was
Well, what
I
was
was
going
elated.
through you?
Oh, mine. I won the lottery. I'm
I
273.
know, but
But
before you found out, you're in the room with your school chums. You're in the room, and this is before you find out what's going to happen. Uh, in your mind, you might very well be chosen. Were you afraid, or were you nonchalant? What?
Nonchalant. I was scared shitless. Are you kidding me? We were all we were all scared shitless. And I got to tell you something. You think it's bad on America's Got Talent or any of these shows? Where they and
Yeah.
the winner, the third places, and they drag it out and drag it out. Okay, so you are. I was 273. So think about that. For 272 times before that, I had to. All right, here we're going. Number one.
Yeah,
It's not my birthday. Oh,
absolutely.
thank God. Okay, but the next one could be number two. It's not my birthday. Okay, number three. It's not my birthday. And each time,
Right.
uh, it took forever. In reality, I don't know, probably took a half hour. But for us, it was forever. It was scary. As I think back, boy, that was just weird.
Uh,
Weird.
that's really good to, or I shouldn't say good, that is interesting to hear. I'll use it as a comparison. Uh, when I graduated from high school in the summer of 59, 59, uh, Vietnam was still a story that involved the French at that point, and I wasn't really aware of the U.S. maneuverings in 1959. All I knew was that I was a high school graduate. I wanted to go to college, didn't have the money. Um, and it just seemed to me in that moment, I think I kind of wanted to either be a famous writer or a movie star. Becoming a reporter was maybe in the offerings, but I hadn't been thinking about it too much. Anyway, I enlisted. I went to the U.S. Marine Corps recruiting station in Hempstead, New York. And I think when I walked in the door, the Marine Corps recruiting sergeant looked up and he smiled, and it looked like he had a wolf smile on his face, like he'd just seen a lamb come in. I don't think I perceived that then, but all through the process of being ushered into the Marine Corps, and as we've heard, as I've tried to share in previous shows, at that point my hearing was as it had been poor, but they never checked it out, and that's it. But I remember more being excited when I got down to Paris Island for boot camp training. And I didn't have that sense of being at war. I was caught up in the experience of being in the South and dealing with Southerners and racism and all the other things that you deal with that first trip outside of your home and that first trip out of your comfort zone. So I never thought in my mind's eye about what it would really be like if I were to be thrust into combat. All I had were these John Wayne war movies where the good guys always win, and some kid gets killed in the first reel. That wasn't real, real. But the more I think about it, I was very, very lucky to be able to say what, and in fact have the hearing pull me out of service. So when I look back on that now, and I read stories like the Tom Brokaw third edition of The Greatest Generation, and see what those folks went through, and of course listening to what my dad said or didn't say, and it was mostly what he didn't say, I realized how fortunate I was to they say once a Marine, you're always a Marine, but once I was uh, shuffled off and out of the service because of my hearing problems, I realized how lucky I was. War stories, we
Oh,
tell these war
absolutely.
stories all the time, and they pale by
Yeah.
comparison when we talk about military wartime.
Yes, I've always felt, when I started the name War Stories, because that's what we used to call it at work, but we
Oh,
always,
yeah, yeah,
knew that, these are not real war stories. These are just, crap
I
that
know.
happened at work. And sadly, I worked with a lot of vets, a lot of Vietnam vets, and they had some serious war stories, but you never heard them. Very, very rarely.
Right.
I don't think I can recall any vet telling any story. It's just something that you don't do. As uh, I,
I
you know,
agree.
George Carlin did the routine of how names change. In World War One, it was called shell shock. Okay, which was a
Right.
very apt name. But then in World War Two, it became a little more refined. It was combat fatigue. Okay, but then by the time you got to Vietnam, it was PTSD.
Yes.
stress, stress disorder. What? They just sort of sugarcoated it. Interesting fact:
Yes.
my my wife Ellen's father, he would have been my father-in-law, died many years. Ellen's father was born in 1891. He was a
Okay.
contemporary of Sigmund Freud. He got married when he was 60 and had Ellen when he was 60 years old. So this guy was a contemporary. He was a psychologist, actually a rather famous psychologist in the psychological world. His name is Abram Gardner.
Right.
And if there's any, psych freaks out there, they'll recognize the name. He was one of the original uh, psychologists who studied with Sigmund Freud. He wrote a book about it, My Analysis with Freud. And he was also the guy, the psychiatrist, he was a psychiatrist, sorry, not psychologist, who basically discovered and studied shell shock from World War One, which became combat fatigue, which became PTSD. He was the one that discovered it, studied it. I don't know if he's the one that coined the phrase shell shock, but just a little side note of history. 6 degrees of
Yes.
separation. So,
I
so
I have the book that you're talking about. Your wife graciously lent it to me. You have to remember. Promise me you'll remember to tell her that. Yes, I still have the book. I haven't finished it, and she can dock me library charges whenever we return it. So I do know the book you're talking about.
oh yeah, she has a number of copies, and it was published in multiple languages too. So, matter of fact, we got a request just a couple of months ago from I think Brazil. Some academic institution in Brazil wants to republish one of his books in Portuguese.
Interesting
So,
stuff.
yeah, yeah,
Really
it's
interesting
really
stuff.
crazy. But so anyway, yeah. So the greatest generation. I feel, you know, for us, for my generation, our generation, when we were growing up, World War II. Well, let's see, I was born in 1951, so World War II had only been over for what 6 7 years, and growing up,
Right.
war movies were very popular. I mean,
Oh
every
yes,
every
yes.
John Wayne movie, and and of course there was a ton of most of these war movies were made during the war. I mean, let's face it, that
Right.
is one of the reasons we won the war. I mean, we had Hollywood, and they had Goebbels, and they're
Yeah.
filmmakers.
Um,
They just didn't have that
you
many.
know, you just keyed me to us. You just keyed me to a story which I had forgotten. I've told the John Wayne story, meeting him and doing the interview. Um, what I forgot, because there are so many layers to a John Wayne interview, meet, or whatever. It just occurred to me as we're talking here that my previous explanation or remembrance of John Wayne was he was in a procession going to Harvard to receive the hasty pudding thing, and we grabbed him off the route. He did the interview, and then he did a Q&A at the award session, and we got another question in with him, and that was it. But what I have just remembered is that after everything was over and it was time for him to go back to the airport and go off to wherever he was headed, he spent another 10 minutes or so. He pulled me over because I had told him I had served in the Marine Corps, and I had also told him that it was a very short stint because of my hearing problems. So he pulls me over and he essentially thanked me for not going through or dealing with the fact that he wasn't actually a GI, that his movies served as his effort. And then he said, I've made all these movies and I'm always in the middle of combat, but to tell you the truth, I don't know how I would react if I was right there on the spot in real time. And I thought, uh, most of us have that same fear. Would we be able to rise up to the image? And I looked at him, the image that you've given us. And he said something like that, and I have to paraphrase it. And he said, "Oh man, I sometimes wonder how many generations of young men I've given a false image of bravery to. And honestly, he looked at me and said, I just don't know if I can live up to being a John Wayne hero in real life. And it made me think, well, I guess a lot of other young men have had to deal with that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have nothing but respect for anybody that served in the military. Believe me, uh, I was very much against the Vietnam War, as as were most of us back then. And but the guys that come back, I mean, look, you know, how many guys come back from Vietnam? They've served, they get injured, they come back, and next thing they're homeless, PTSD. They're just thrown. They're just forgotten. First Iraq War,
Yeah,
boom, bunch of homeless guys, suicides. Iraq War II, Afghanistan. It's just the same story over and over. Nobody comes back the same when you go over there, especially you know when you. All right, I think the thing about World War One and World War II is that everybody can pretty much agree that was a war we really had to do. It was pretty black and white. Nazis are bad. Okay, the
right.
Japanese were not good people. We committed, they committed atrocities, and so did both sides. I mean, everybody forgets when a war starts. It starts off thinking it's sort of civilized, but it degenerates really quickly. I mean,
Yeah,
when World War One, mustard gas, all sorts of horrible things that were so bad that they banned them. All right, and so in
right.
World War II, there were, but there were very few lines that you wouldn't cross because, all right, when the war started, you didn't bomb a city. Okay, it's just you bombed military targets. Okay,
Right.
until
Right.
uh, we did a raid. I think it was a famous raid, and there's probably a movie about it, and I'm sure that you know what the movie is. Uh, there was an air raid, a bombing run over Berlin. Okay, they dropped,
Right.
they made it to Berlin. Okay, and it was, I don't know who did it. I don't think it was Jimmy Doolittle. That was the going off an aircraft carrier to 30
For
seconds over Tokyo.
30 seconds over
Um,
Tokyo. Yeah.
over Tokyo. But anyway, uh, Berlin got bombed. Hitler got really pissed off, and he started the Blitz, where he just dropped endless bombs on London. And
Right.
so you see, wars degenerate really, really fast. I mean, we started off with that, and then let's get real, guys. We ended at dropping 2 nuclear bombs. All right, which is pretty frigging barbaric. I mean, I know
It
we're the
is.
greatest country and we're all great people, but and I'm not saying that dropping the bomb was correct or not correct. I have no right, to do. Hindsight is 2020. Yes, one can make the argument that you could have done the same amount of damage with conventional bombings. You just would have had to done a lot more of them. But then, look, they made the decision, okay? And then thank God it's the only
They
time a
did.
bomb's ever been dropped, and hopefully, it never will. I have always found the subject fascinating. I mean, it was the whole race, the Manhattan Project, and not just the Manhattan Project, but the stuff that the Allies had to do to prevent the Germans from getting the bomb are also
Right.
fantastic stories, which were actually made into movies. I think The Heroes of Telemark. There was a famous raid.
Operation
They
Crossbow also.
uh, think so. Yes. All right. The Germans were ahead of us in research to make the bomb. All right. But
Right.
in order to do research to make the bomb, you needed a thing called heavy water, which was I think H3O, deuterium or something like that. And it's
Right.
something that you need, and you need a lot of it. So, and it has to be manufactured. So, it was manufactured in a factory in I think Norway or Sweden. I'm gonna guess Norway.
Right. I think
And
Norway.
yes, and the SOE and the OSS went in there, and the first thing they did is they managed to contaminate the whole batch. A couple of hundred thousand gallons. So that whole run was shot. Well, the Germans then they got wise and they just put this thing was on an island, okay? And the only way to get in and off the island, on and off, was by boat. And so they made the next batch, and they made sure that nothing could, you know, interfere with it. And they
Right.
had a route planned where they were going to ship it to wherever they had to ship it in Germany. And they had this was guarded up the wazoo. There was just no way any special operations force could get it, except it had to go on a little itty bitty ferry to get the water from the island to the mainland. And they
Right.
did manage
Right.
to sneak on the night before. They put a bomb with a timer on it in the bow of the boat, timed because, and
Right.
counting on, counting on German efficiency that that train was going to come down and they were going to load it onto that boat. And it was timed so the boat was in the middle of the fjord and the bomb went off. And because it was in the bow sank first, meaning that the engine is up out of the water. So there was nothing
Right.
they could do.
Right.
And they sunk the boat. And it was those two missions that gave us the leeway to
Right.
continue and do the research to actually develop the bomb. Yeah, World War II has the most fascinating. I mean, real war stories are actually the coolest stories because you read them and they're like novels. There's a book called The Bodyguard of
Hmm.
Lies. I highly recommend anybody who hasn't read it get it. It's the whole history
They
of
should.
all of the spy campaigns.
It's really necessary.
Yes,
The
all of the
latest Brokaw book, which is a collection of memories, its written form is interesting. Excuse me. The main part of each page contains the letter written by the survivor, the GI survivor, or a parent or a loved one. And next to it, and facing closest to the centerfold, there's a summary of all the incidents that occurred across 1940, 1941. The casualty numbers, for instance, when Germany uh, invaded Russia, the amount of casualties on both sides. It's mind staggering. And all of these years later, fully aware of what went on, but at my age, reading back and seeing the numbers in print, you begin to slowly get a sense of how horrific it was. And in the back of your mind, you again think, and it brings me full circle about being afraid to be in combat. You realize how lucky you were not to be there then, or back there then, or lucky not to have been taken to Vietnam. It's a real lesson in history to be aware of.
oh yeah,
How they always say it's the old men who make the decision to go to war, but it's the young men who have to fight and die.
have to fight and die. Um, all right, my dad was in the Navy. But he was very lucky. He served on a submarine tender, the USS Otis, and its job was to fix submarines and resupply them. So,
Hmm.
by necessity, their orders were if the battle was that way, they went that way because their job was
Right.
to resupply. So they always had lots of food, lots of drink, and machine shops. So he was never actually in combat. He did tell the great story of one time he a bunch of zeros, 5 or 6 zeros, uh, found the ship, and there was one American, I don't know, nearby in a P-58 Mustang, and they're all having a dogfight. And there was a gunner. They did have a gun. I mean, it was a Navy ship, and the gunner
Hmm.
who never really got to shoot the gun got to shoot the gun, the anti-aircraft gun, and the only plane that he shot down was the American. And that pilot, he lived, and they pulled him out of the drink, and apparently this pilot just ripped everyone right up to and including the captain a new asshole because he
Right.
was really pissed. I mean, but I thought, it was a funny story. My uncle was at Pearl Harbor. Okay, he served on the USS Wasp, which was one of the ones
Right.
that were sunk that are still sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Now, it was because it was a Sunday, he was off the ship. And that's the only reason that he survived. And oddly enough, he was assigned to the new USS Wasp, the ship that replaced that one, and he served that during the war.
Hmm.
But you're talking about how veterans don't talk. He never talked about Pearl Harbor.
Right.
My
Right.
cousins and I, throughout our entire lives, we would ask him, and he just, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And we always, wished it. But apparently, very late in his life, they went to Hawaii and they visited Pearl Harbor. And at the monument of the Arizona, they routinely ask after they do the whole tour, they routinely ask if there are any veterans or if there are any, you know, survivors of Pearl Harbor, and they invite
Right.
them to come up and speak. And he raised his hand, and apparently he went up and he talked, and he was very passionate. And I remember my cousin saying, "Wow, it was just." Dad never, we'd
Yeah.
never heard this before, and I wasn't there, so I don't remember what he said, but it was probably very, you would realize why, people don't want to talk about that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And speaking of
It,
talking about kind of
are we
stuff,
at that time?
we've done it again. We are at that time. We did it again. We're not only at that time, we're over that time. So I don't know. Well, I've done 3 shows today, and in each case, I had no idea what I was going to talk about when we started, and I basically have no idea what we said when we finished. So
Well,
probably means they came out okay.
today was serious.
Today was
Yeah, today we were
serious.
not
Yes, I mean we can.
recalling any famous
We were
people
not.
or whatever. Today was serious, and I'm really happy that we had the time to talk about it because
Yeah.
the when
No,
we
we
see,
should.
for instance, the Ukraine story in the nightly news, I don't know whether
Exactly.
people really are impacted by the devastation and the death they see. I think it's
No,
just another news
they're not.
story.
They're not. But even though we are over, I will throw this in. I do remember, and you would remember too, when we were at ABC Radio Network, one of my jobs, especially on the overnight shift, was to take in the overseas Saigon feed. All right. And it was this
Right,
overseas channel, and it was the death reports. And it was done, I
right,
don't know if it was done in a very dry, you know, today,
right.
2,000 North Vietnamese regulars were killed, 8,000 Viet Cong, and 2 Americans. But it came over this overseas circuit, which was it was just the weirdest sounding thing. It had sort of an echo. It had sort of and
Yeah.
the voice didn't sound like a real voice. And I just always remember being at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, basically in a room by myself, taking in, recording this feed of this endless drone of deaths. And
It,
and I remember there
It
was,
was it
yeah,
was
it
a
was strange.
weird feeling. I remember being in that room and hearing those numbers, and also I remember, and we've talked about this before, but it bears repetition for those who don't know history. The reporter who was feeding the tape from Saigon would invariably come on at the end and say, "Listen, Gary or Tom, those are the real numbers. Those are the accurate numbers, regardless of what you hear at your end. These are the real numbers." So, and we'd say thank you very much. And over the course of years, it became sort of a bond between the people in the New York studios and the guys feeding the reports in from Vietnam. But you get through taking in those tapes, and then somebody would say, "Get back in there. We've got the latest casualty reports coming in from the DOD in Washington." And the DOD in Washington's numbers didn't mesh up at all. In other words, they were lies, just flat out lies.
Yep,
And we were told,
flat out lies.
use the DOD Washington numbers. Do not use the numbers you've gotten from the correspondent in Vietnam. That was a
Yep,
mandate.
a mandate. Yes,
So,
I remember there was a famous quote from a North Vietnamese general, and they were talking about the reports where it was 3,000 Viet Cong, 1,000 North Vietnamese regulars, 200 Americans. And the general said, "This is good. They're going to quit soon
right.
because they can't suffer those kind of losses." In other words, 1,000, 2,000 feet. No, big. No, we don't give a shit. But 200 Americans. Oh yeah, they can't
Yeah,
handle that.
yeah.
And the guy was right. I mean, that's what that's what ended the war when too many people coming home in body bags. Well, on that note, boy, this has been a chipper show. Uh, so let's liven it up and see
So much for
how
the
fast we can
laughter.
get through. Yeah, so much. How much we can get through the friggin' plugs? Okay, your Marilyn's blog, Serendipity: Seeking Intelligent Life on Earth. Great blog, love it. We all contributed to it. Voicescapes Audio Theater, best for audio theater and best for audio comedy and drama. Half-hour radio show. The cult hit is still around thanks to the internet, and of course, Get Off My Lawn with me, where we talk about life, the universe, and anything else. Gary, it has been a hoot and a holler, and we'll do it again. But until then, toodles.